Hey guys, what's up? Public here, back with another video, and this is the last of our kind of installments on Shadow Priest in Season 4. Hopefully you enjoyed these videos this week. Today we're going to talk about Trinkets, and this is going to kind of cap off the series here, hopefully help you kickstart your Season 4 journey as a Shadow Priest. So I'm going to kind of cover best Trinkets to use in kind of a PV situation from Raid and Mythic Plus. If you haven't already seen this, is all just going to be kind of off the Icy Veins guide, and I'm going to go a little bit in detail on a couple of these Trinkets. So let's dive in. Alright, before I kind of dive into this list, I know you can already read it, I do want to note I'm not covering every single trinket that you can get in Season 4, because we have access to 3 raids worth of trinkets, plus a whole set of Dragonflight dungeons. There are quite a lot to cover here. Generally safe to assume, if it's not on this list, it's really not a top trinket as a Shadow Priest. You might still see people make some of them work, but generally speaking, these are the ones that you're going to want to target. Okay, now for this, I'm going to kind of in 2 categories. We have Raiding and Mythic Plus. Now you can always kind of swap these around for raiding. If you're trying to get like more AoE damage on like a council fight, consider swapping to some of the Mythic Plus trinkets. Vice versa, if you're in Mythic Plus and you're trying to optimize for more pure single target, you can use the raiding list. But just so you know, we do have 2 lists here. So let's cover raiding first. We're going to go pretty much just going to cover the top 2 tiers and the common trinkets that you're going to see. And there's a couple caveats with some of these, so keep that in mind. Top tier from like an S tier perspective, in really no particular order here. These can kind of be jumbled around. The first one we'll talk about is Umbral Skull's Fractured Heart. So this is a new trinket that's been redesigned a little bit here. And it's just a passive AoE trinket that just does damage, which is great. What's really cool with this is they've added a new execute effect, which I think this is actually the old tooltip, but the execute effect is sometimes when the dot procs on an enemy, when it falls below 5% health, it just gets executed. This will not work on bosses, at least we don't think it will. But on any fight with adds, you're going to get great value out of this trinket. So I have a feeling it's going to be used by quite a lot of people. If you can get just 1 proc on an add, it's best in slot, basically. A little bit RNG of like getting that actual proc, but if it happens, you get a lot of value from the trinket. So fights with adds, this thing's going to be great. Next up, we have Naimu's Unraveling Spindle coming back and returning, particularly for immobilized targets. So if you didn't know, this trinket is just a mastery stat stick, but when you use it, it deals more damage if the target is immobilized. Now, usually what that means is the target is like static and it's not moving. So the big examples from Amirdasil were Volcaros or Naimu. You also have things like Gnarlroot during his intermission phase that are considered immobilized. This doesn't work for everything though, and it's not always like if the boss is not moving, it counts. A good example of this is Tindrill's intermission. The boss isn't moving, but he's not actually immobilized. So there's a couple of those examples here. The full list is in the guide if you cover in the Naimu section down here. Every raid has a couple of these, just based off of logs. I will update the list as we get into the raids and test it more, but from what I have a good first pass at what this will work on. Next up, we have Neltharion's Call to Suffering. This is a kind of class trinket for priests, rogues, death knights, and druids. And this is just a very strong trinket, particularly because when it drops, it's at a higher item level tier, so you get a bit more item level here, which means it's a little bit over budget, which makes it pretty nice. Now, the one thing to keep in mind, it is kind of a low proc chance trinket, so it's somewhat feast or famine. If you get a lot of procs, you're going to like top damage and get a great parse, but you could get no procs, and it's going to be kind of frustrating. But usually, even taking the middle ground average approach, it's going to average out to be a very strong trinket. Next up are the ones that are going to depend on your raids. So first up, we have Ominous Chromatic Essence, which allows you to pick a secondary stat. And then for everyone else using the trinket, if they have a different secondary stat, you will get a portion of what they've chosen. So if you have 5 people wearing this trinket in your group, and each one of them is attuned to a different Dragonflight, that's where you get the most benefit from this trinket, and it's clearly best in slot when that happens. The problem is that can be kind of inconsistent. You need, like I said, 1 of each stat or Dragonflight, and having 5 people that will wear it. In Mythic Plus, that's going to be somewhat unlikely. Usually tanks are probably not going to prefer running this, but maybe your tank does. You also need to get 5 of them to drop or buy them from the Bullion vendor. In Raid, however, this could be more of a possibility. As a Shadow Priest, we can kind of run whatever we need to fill that group. So before your raid or dungeon group starts, you can kind of play around with who has what stat. If we had a preference, Emerald and Ruby, which is crit and versatility, are both great options because they won't be subject to the DR as a Shadow Priest. We just don't stack those stats enough. But as you're gearing out, you might see that Bronze, which is haste, or even Azure or Obsidian do really well as well. Like I said, we can basically run anything. Just might want to adjust your gear to compensate. The other one to cover is Whispering Incarnate Icon. Again, this is a great kind of secondary stat trinket. It was recently nerfed, so in previous videos, I said this thing was like turbo best in slot. After the nerfs, it's still really strong, particularly inside of dungeons, because it gives you that like crit budget if you end up dropping that for using Verse Flask or something. So even by itself, with no one else wearing it, it's pretty good. But as soon as you get a healer or a tank to wear it, this thing becomes pretty great. And if you get a tank and a healer to use it, it's S tier, one of our best in slot trinkets for sure. If it's only a healer or only a tank, I kind of drop it down to A tier. And then if no one else is using it, it's still pretty good as well. And the final trinket that I put in S tier is Spoils of Neltharis, which is making a return. This thing is just a great trinket for us. We're a 2-minute spec. We love secondary stats, basically all the secondary stats. So it just works out really well for our spec. Other trinkets to consider as like a good option inside of raiding. Again, like I already mentioned, Whispering Incarnate Icon. Umbral Skull's Fractured Heart, even if there are no ads, is still a really nice trinket. So if you don't have anything else to run in that's like in this S tier bucket, Umbral Skulls is still really nice. Belleros the Suncaller did get nerfed a little bit in terms of how it's used, so it's kind of a casted 2-minute trinket. But for fights with ads, you can kind of pad with this trinket, which is nice. But keep in mind, weirdly enough, as you add targets, other trinkets scale better than this. If you can hit them all equally. So, bursting down padding on ads, this is good. Or just honestly a pure single target, it's a decent option if it's your only on-use trinket. Nymes is also really strong, even if it's non-immobilized targets. You can consider that a good option. And another one in raid, particularly for like sustained fights with single target, is Vessel of Searing Shadow. Also a great option. There's some other ones in here that are okay in kind of the B tier. Generally stuff C and D you're only going to see in kind of rare circumstances. A lot of these guys down here in C or D in particular are really good in AoE fights, which is why I included it here, or maybe they were used in Mythic Plus, that kind of thing. So that is your kind of high-level overview of trinkets for raiding. All right, let's talk about trinkets inside of Mythic Plus. So I'm not going to cover in depth any of them I've already mentioned, just kind of high level, and let's talk about the new ones. So starting off in S tier, we have a new guy at the clear top of this list. Generally speaking, again, not ordered, but this guy maybe should be in its own tier of its own, is Tome of Unstable Power. So the tooltip still isn't right, but it did get reworked in this patch. So it's just a proc effect that just does a lot of damage. That's really all that you need to know. It's not like a top single target trinket, but it does so much damage in AoE that it makes sense to use in basically every key environment. If you really need single target, consider using something else that's a bit more versatile. But man, this thing just shreds through trash and is great in any build. Otherwise, we also still have things like Neltharion's Call to Suffering. Ominous Chromatic Essence is going to be really strong. Again, it's going to probably end up being between A and S tier here, kind of depending on how many allies are actually using it. The more the better here. If your whole group is using it, this thing is great. If it's just like 2 or 3 of you, it's okay, but not best in slot. Whispering Incarnate Icon is actually very, very strong, even if it's just you using it, particularly with Void Form. Void Form just loves this thing because of just the crit. It just lets you budget your gear differently. Depending on what you're actually running, you might see different results, but if you can get like a healer to run this, or definitely a healer and a tank, this thing is really, really strong. Other guys that are in S tier are Spoils of Neltharis coming back from the raid setup, and then Ashes of the Ember Soul. So the reason why Ashes of the Ember Soul wasn't included, especially S or A tier kind of before in the raid setup, is mostly because we don't need to stack haste as much in those gear setups. But inside of Mythic Plus, like I mentioned before, if you watch the stats video, Void Eruption will go all the way upwards of like 42% haste and still love that stat. So Ashes just becomes really strong, and I put it in S tier for that reason. If you're running Dark Ascension, not as good of a trinket, but still pretty good. In A tier, we have a couple new ones that have joined as well. Pip's Emerald Friendship Badge is still strong. Furious Rage Feather is actually okay. It was nerfed at the end of Season 1. A lot of you guys are probably wondering why you haven't seen it sooner mentioned in this video, but they have never reverted that nerf. So it's an okay trinket, particularly in AoE, but does has some awkwardness with positioning. So it will generally always sim better than it actually is in practice. But if you get lucky, it can be really strong. Also still have Umbral Skulls, Fractured Heart, Vessel of Searing Shadows. So I'm going to put this on here, but there is kind of a caveat. It's a solid trinket, even with targets dying and things like that, because it's giving us haste. But you want to keep in mind this does give a dot on you when this procs, which can pull you out of invisibility skips. So if you're doing a key and you know you need to do an invis skip, do not run this trinket, basically. It's just going to be annoying. You can, I think, cancel that buff, but it's just, yeah, it's annoying. Other ones, Screaming Black Dragon Scale kind of scales very nicely. Another thing that's nice about this trinket, particularly for pushing keys, is every time it procs, you also get a good amount of leech as well, which is always a nice extra thing to have. Ominous Chromatic Essence, again, still going to be a good trinket even if no one else is wearing it, particularly because it's going to kind of help fill your stats in and even stack even more haste if you go bronze. A couple other ones to mention, Igneous Flowstone, just a nice damage proc trinket. You can also run Augury of the Primal Flame. This one would have been stronger, especially now that we can buy it, but it does not get the increased item level, so it's not getting that extra boost there. So it's okay for us. You can use it depending on your group. Ruby Whelpshell is actually okay as well. And there's also Erupting Spear Fragment and Belleros, a couple other AoE trinkets as well. You could use these to help fill out your damage pattern. They're not the best for every situation. Like Spear Fragment or Ice Blood aren't great single target, for example. But if you really need to burst down a bunch of small adds, maybe it makes sense. Think things like Algathar Academy when you have all of those mobs that you can't really hit. These are basically the pad trinkets you can use instead. And usually speaking, I would avoid things like Nimuse. Just doesn't work very well in Mythic Plus because of the long channel time. Desperate Invoker's Codex is okay inside of raiding, for example, but the stacks reset every time you pull a new pack and doesn't get that kind of sustained damage out really ever, maybe in certain high keys, but even then it's kind of meh. So, and that is basically all you need to know about trinkets as a Shadow Priest going into Season 4. Hopefully this was helpful. Big shout out to everyone that supports me on Patreon and YouTube. And this caps off our kind of Season 4 videos. I don't know if I'll do much else for Season 4 for the rest of the season. I will be mostly focused on doing alpha content for the War Within and all the good stuff happening there. But I might do a couple things here and there for Season 4 as things show up. So again, big thanks to everyone for watching. We'll catch you next time. See ya.